Good evening, everyone. It is a great pleasure to be welcoming Matthew John Hadodo to the LESoL online seminar series. Matthew is a social linguist whose research concerns social differentiations and how social meaning is mapped onto linguistic variation by social practices. His academic career began when he obtained his BA in linguistics and Spanish linguistics from Rutgers University in 2010, and his master's in Spanish linguistics from NYU in 2013. Earning his PhD in social linguistics from the University of Pittsburgh in 2020, Matthew has been working as postdoctoral researcher at the University of Bern Center for the Study of Language and Society since February 2021. At Bern, Matthew has taught many seminars such as intercultural communication, language, ethnicity, race and language, mobility and migration, and he has continued doctoral research on the Istanbul Greek community. As a heritage speaker of Istanbul Greek, Matthew has conducted fieldwork 3 times with the community, twice in Turkey and once in Greece in Athens, with Istanbul Greek migrants. He currently has a manuscript for the Journal of Social Linguistics that is accepted with revisions, and a book for Routledge's Critical Studies in Multilingualism series. He's co-editing this book with Elena Ioannidou and Petros Karatsareas, whom we have had the pleasure of hosting here on LESoL before. On minoritized Greek communities. And his talk today focuses on ethnographic considerations and social linguistic outcomes of the Istanbul Greek community. The talk is entitled Ethnography in Indigenous Minoritized Communities, the case of Istanbul Greek. Matthew, it's a great pleasure and honor to have you with us. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. I want to extend my biggest thanks to both Professor Kanaki as well as the University of the Aegean and LESoL for the warm invitation and for the kind introduction. As was said in the intro, my work has been continued on the Istanbul Greek community, although I sometimes wonder if I should refer to it as Istanbul Greek communities because of how diverse and heterogeneous the community actually is. And it's actually very personal for me because as a heritage speaker, my mother's side of the family, my mother's side of the family was part of the Istanbul Greek community. And so a lot of the questions that I had emerged as being born in the US to migrant parents with a very sort of distinct trajectory, so to speak. And I'll talk a little bit about that today. I've been very, very fortunate to give a few different presentations on my work, either from a more technical linguistic standpoint, looking at structure of language, or from a more discursive perspective. But today it's nice to have how I'm going to turn more of a conversation about ethnography and sort of the other components that go into this type of research, as well as some other considerations. I just want to show this photo here. I liked it as the title page, one, because I think it's a nice photo, but also because it is in Ortaköy or Mesochori, the middle village, along the Bosphorus. And it actually, I think, is a nice microcosm of Istanbul because it's always been one of the most integrated neighborhoods of the city with lots of Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and Muslims coming together. And behind it, you have the Bosphorus Bridge bridging the European and Asian continents, which I think also is a sort of nice symbol. So as I said, this is going to be a little bit more of a conversation as opposed to some other talks I've given. But we'll start with some background information on the community and then spending most of the time with different ethnographic considerations, but spending a little bit of time looking at sociolinguistic outcomes and how to maybe make use of ethnography and other types of sociolinguistic research. I do want to say that although I'm not going to be as focused on linguistic structure in this presentation, I do have many slides on linguistic structure that I will very quickly go through, and anyone who's attending via Zoom, for example, is welcome to screenshot it, or if you want to take photos of it, you can, and anyone is welcome to ask questions later. And yes, I'm giving the presentation in English, αλλά μπορείτε και στα ελληνικά να με ρωτήσετε ύστερα, όπως θέλετε, όπως προτιμάτε. So as we go on, in terms of the Istanbul Greek community, there's only about 2,000 Greeks left in Istanbul, as opposed to hundreds of thousands at the turn of the 20th century. And that's due to a series of geopolitical policies that were taking place for many reasons. Some of them I'll go over in a bit. But as a result, there's been thousands in the diaspora, primarily Athens and the Paleophagoro neighborhood in particular. And that's because the Athenian Riviera reminded many of the Istanbul Greeks of the Bosphorus, the shores of the Marmara Sea, etc. But of course, there are Istanbul Greeks in other parts of Greece, Europe, and the rest of the world for that matter. And something that's important to note is that while they're an indigenous community, they're not a homogeneous one. And what I mean by that is that since the settlement by Doric Greeks from Megara in about 700 BC, what was Byzantium and later Constantinople had Greeks from all over the Greek-speaking world that came together, in particular from northern Greece and Epirus mostly, but also from islands such as Chios, Crete, as well as parts of Asia Minor. And this gave way to a very specific ecology in terms of the language, the different dialectal features that came together, but also in terms of other sort of character that we'll see continued moving forward. Obviously, the Ottoman Empire saw the transition of a Byzantine sort of Greek-centric community to a more Turkic one. But the Istanbul Greeks always occupied a sort of privileged position among the millets, the different sort of minoritized communities based on religion, more so than the others, including the other Greeks, in part because of the patriarchate, which was located there, and the famous district of the Fanari, in which the sort of local elite occupied imperial positions in the imperial court, such as princes for Wallachia and Moldova, among others, serving as translators for the emperor, etc. But of course, not all Istanbul Greeks were elites working as princes, and many tended to occupy a more mercantile class. And in particular, towards the end of the Ottoman Empire and even the first few decades of the Turkish Republic, many were shopkeepers, in particular known for their French-style patisseries, many of whom were trained in France, as well as those who studied architecture, connections to fishing and shipping industries, as well as, of course, the patriarchate. And it's important to note that the ecumenical Greek Orthodox Patriarchate, which is housed in Istanbul, in order to be the patriarch, you have to be born in Turkey. So that's another sort of important dynamic, we can say, in terms of how Istanbul Greeks sort of understand their brand of Greekness. And in addition to all the different types of Greek people coming together, lots of other sorts of communities came together in Istanbul, whether it was Byzantium, Constantinople, or of course Istanbul, certainly with the Turkish-speaking Turks, but also Franco-Levantines, so French, Italian, Catalans from Western Europe that migrated to Eastern Mediterranean with their languages, local Armenians, and the Ladino-speaking Sephardi community, Sephardic Jews that were expelled from Spain in 1492, many of whom relocated, that were welcomed actually into the Ottoman Empire. And as a result, a few anthropologists and historians that have been looking at the Istanbul Greek community in Greece has pointed out how this idea of cosmopolitanism has been very important for how the Istanbul Greeks émigré community has sort of differentiated themselves from other mainland and other Greeks. So as I mentioned before, there were a series of geopolitical movements, we can say, that shaped the community. We'll have to start with the population exchange with the Treaty of Lausanne, which is not very far away from me, about an hour-and-a-half train ride from Bern here. The population of Greeks around that time, before the 1920s, was about between 300 and 350,000. However, many of them were not necessarily local. Some of them were more recent newcomers who were forced as part of the exchange to leave. Some of you may know that the population exchange required about 1.5 million Orthodox Christians of Asia Minor to be exchanged with about 500,000 Muslims from what is now Greece, even though some of them were not necessarily Greek-speaking or Turkish-speaking and vice versa. Exempt from that, however, were Muslims in Western Thrace, and then the Greek community of Istanbul, as well as the islands of the Imbros and Tenedos by the Dardanelles. However, some of this number, of the 350,000 or so, didn't qualify, and they were forced to go. And there were also some Istanbul Greek elite that were in favor of enosis or Greek irredentism, and some of them left due to fear of fallout of what may happen, and others that were just uncertain about the situation. So we see the number dwindle to a little bit over 100,000. But then we see the varlık vergisi, or capital gains or wealth tax of the 1940s, which primarily targeted minoritized communities, mostly Armenians, but also the Istanbul Greeks and Jews and other community members at that. And if you weren't able to pay these exorbitant taxes, you had to go to labor camps. And so some people left as a result of that. And in 1955, they have the Septembriana, or the Istanbul Greek pogrom during September 6th and 7th. My grandmother was actually pregnant with my mother at the time. And I can tell you a story about that if you'd like later on. And despite both of those catastrophic occurrences, the population was still more or less stable at around 80,000. Where we see really the true sort of turning point for the demographic shift was in 1964, where due to the ongoing conflicts in Cyprus, the Istanbul Greeks were scapegoated and sort of used as a pawn in the geopolitical scheme. And even though the local Istanbul Greeks, some of them were eligible to receive a Greek passport, anyone who had one was considered a traitor to the Turkish nation and was deported, so-called deportation. That only actually affected about 10,000 people, but of course you're going to leave with your families in tow. And these people that had to leave, their assets were seized, they weren't able to take all of their belongings, bank accounts, all of those things were sort of appropriated by the Turkish government. And that's really where we see the population halved. And then in particular in the 70s and then early 80s, we see continued tensions over the ongoing Cyprus issue. And that's when many more left. That's when my parents, for example, left Turkey in the early 70s. And since the early 80s, the population has been under 10,000. And for the past 30 years or so, stable between 2,000 and 3,000 people, more or less, although it's very difficult actually to get an accurate number. So for those of you who've never been yet, here is a map of modern-day Istanbul, which is much larger than the old city. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I'm highlighting this lower European peninsula, which is the old city where Hagia Sophia is located, where the imperial palace was. It's separated with the upper peninsula by the Golden Horn, Khrishoukeras, or the Haliç. And the neighborhood that is now Beyoğlu was actually called Pera because it was beyond the Golden Horn. And it's important to note that the Istanbul Greeks have never been really ghetto. They've avoided ghettoization. They've sort of been all over the coast of the Marmara Sea, up both sides of the Bosphorus, from the European and Asian sides, as well as the Prince Islands. And my research, I had to interview people from all over, which was beautiful, but also extremely stressful at times. And I'll explore a little bit about that. And again, when I say they resisted ghettoization, even though certain neighborhoods such as Tatavla, or now Kurtuluş, was predominantly Greek, there's always been Armenians, Jews, Syriac Orthodox, Turkish Muslims, of course, all sort of integrated in a very succinct way, at least decades ago. So part of my ongoing research as a sociolinguist, as somebody with family ties, that, you know, the only experience with Greek I had when I was young was through my family. And when I started high school and I met, you know, many Greek Americans in the New York City area, they would say, oh, you say this word different from how I do, or your pronunciation's funny. And it wasn't until I went to undergrad and attended university that I saw, oh, there's linguistics as a field. Now I can learn all about, you know, the different Greek dialects. And yet I couldn't find a single thing on Istanbul Greek, except occasionally in passing that it's not that different from the Greek that's spoken in Athens, which I said, that's not true. So that began some of my research questions. But as somebody who's really interested in how does the language then get used to sort of do different social work in terms of how people differentiate themselves, how people understand themselves as opposed to other people. Those were some of my initial questions. But then also in terms of today's talk, what I want to also sort of venture is, how do you capture so much diversity within a very small community that is very much heterogeneous? And in doing this type of research, how do you make a vulnerable population feel comfortable? So in order to address these things, you know, as I mentioned, there was really nothing written on the dialect. If we even want to call it a dialect, I am now more of the idea that's either a pool or a series of repertoire of different features, but we can talk about that. But you needed to have at least some kind of a baseline. So I needed to do a more traditional sort of documentation description of the variety. And even though I had been in Istanbul a few times before with my family, the first time I did field work was when I received a grant for the summer of 2016. I was there for about 3 months. And I decided to wait about 3 weeks, actively engaged with the community. Thankfully, I have my aunt who still lives in Istanbul. It's actually her birthday today. So Chronia Pola, Tia Lena. And she was very kind to introduce me to her and my mother's second cousins, and who are more involved in the community and the church in particular, who, you know, that kind of spearheaded a lot of my initial field work. And as Professor Kanaki said earlier, I went to Athens for a few months in the summer to interview some of the migrants, first generation that left for different reasons. And then I went back again in 2018 for a few more months, this time in the fall, as people advised me, why did you come in the spring? We're all on vacation. We have more events going on. In the winter, it's better. But when you're teaching classes and taking classes, you don't always have the luxury of choosing when you can go and do these things. And then after a few weeks of observation, 3 weeks or so, that's when I started to try to interview people to collect other types of data other than sort of observations and recordings in larger environments. And that's when I did the interviews. I would have people sort of tell me a little bit about their background, their life stories, and then also sort of elicitation, showing them photographs of things like onions, and are they going to say cremidi or cromidi, and cucumbers, are they going to say anguri, or are they going to say grosero, which was what I knew as the local production, for example. And all sorts of other types of elicitation tasks, including at the very end asking about differences in the varieties. Even though I'm interested in questions about identity, I knew it wouldn't be very appropriate to ask Istanbul Greeks of how do you feel? Do you feel Greek? Do you feel this or that? So I tried to avoid those types of questions, and we'll talk a little bit more about that moving forward. And again, all of that was sort of for the cause of getting at bigger pictures of attitudes and ideologies of how the language is reflecting and constructing social meaning and social difference. So as I mentioned, this was very personal work for me. It's something that my grandmother was very, helped raise me. I was very close with her. And so here's some of her family. She was born in Istanbul when it was still Konstantinopoli and when it was still the Ottoman Empire in 1918. And her family was actually from Cappadocia, even though she was born in Istanbul. She was specifically born in Scutari, formerly Chrysopoli, and now Üsküdar in Turkish, on the Asian coast. Her family, as I mentioned, were from Cappadocia. And although she was born Vesvi in Makridu, the family was actually Uzunoğlu, and some kept the last name Uzunoğlu, some changed it to Makridis. And although I couldn't find a large photo of her immediate family, this is actually her uncle Pavlos Makridis' family. As you can see, had many children, and many of them have since relocated to Greece and elsewhere, and some of them are still in Istanbul. But it just gives you a sort of sense of what the Istanbulite culture was like in the early 20th century. And here is my grandmother with my mother when the 1950s, and I believe Proti, the first of the Prince Islands. It's called Proti because it's closest to the coast. And basically, as I mentioned, they were my sort of gateway into the community and my research. And it was very important in order for people to feel comfortable with me as an outsider. Sometimes people asking questions with the recorder isn't really welcomed when there's only a few thousand people, and when there's a history of that region not necessarily being people concerned about being misconstrued or their statements, if they're on the record, being used for different purposes. But, by mentioning, oh, my grandmother was Desmond Magrido and she came from here. And my mother was was raised in Tatavla and so on, that made people more comfortable, even if, they didn't know me personally. So as I mentioned, my family was from Cappadocia. They helped establish this church, Profitilia, in the Balarbash district of Scutari, Üsküdar. And here I was in 2016, my first field trip. They're celebrating or they're commemorating a 40-day memorial service. And many of these people I actually ended up interviewing, and others were very informative of my work. And I want to specifically mention here my mother's second cousin, Ilyas Fedon Uzunoğlu, and his sister, Ioana, and their friend Yelda. They helped, especially Ilyas, when I first arrived in 2016. That's me when I still had hair, by the way. They helped really get me, get people to feel comfortable with me and introduce me to people. And in particular, that first year when I was trying to find mostly older generations that would be more likely to maintain dialectal features, which I later went on to collect all different demographics, age groups. And this is actually right after I had interviewed their friend Yelda, who's a very accommodating person. Many people prefer to meet in public. Ideally, I would go to their homes, which I did for several people. But oftentimes I would have to go to either a bar or a cafe, a restaurant, which in particular for an acoustic analysis is not necessarily great. But if people are comfortable, you have to sort of do what they need. And if that means sacrificing the quality of the recordings and what you can do with the data analysis, then that's sort of what you're left with. The same thing when I was interviewing people on the Prince Islands and you have heavy winds, some of those data points are lost. But I'm very grateful for, in addition to Ilyas, also specific sort of gatekeepers to the community, such as, well, first of all, I have to say Danay Palakolu, who is from Rumvadir/Sirki, which I believe is the Sindesmos, Iposirikson, Remekon, Kinoton, Idrimaton, basically the Istanbul Greek communities. She very much helped me recruit people, find people. Also, the principal of Zoografio High School, Lithio, Kyrios Sayanis Dimitriolo, was very, very kind, one of the most open people I've ever met, and he is certainly a gatekeeper. A lot of people trust him, and by having him sort of vouch for me, it made other people more comfortable to interact with me and to be ultimately interviewed. Of course, not everybody, and we'll talk about some of those issues. But in terms of sort of how the community makes sense of their lived space, what we have here is actually, it may be faint to see, it says Arena Goyio. So it used to be a boys' school actually just opposite of Profitilia Church. But while it was meant for the local communities to send their children to school there, with the diminished population, it ultimately was purchased by the Turkish government and converted into I believe, a music and film institute. And normally there's a Turkish flag that covers up the Greek writing, but on a particularly windy day, it was blown over. And I thought it was also a nice reflection of the community, kind of the relics of what's been maintained, and the Turkish flag sort of trying to cover it. But you see it's built in this neoclassical style. And I thought it was important to sort of engage with how the people are making sense of their lived space with doing this ethnography. And while I did go to certain people's houses or, met them in public, there were a few people that had a couple alternatives. One of whom was a wonderful man, one of the most giving interviewees I've ever had. Before we had the interview proper, he wanted to show me his neighborhood in Balat, which is a district in the Fanari district or neighborhood. And so he gave me a tour of his neighborhood, including the house that he grew up in, the church that he went to, that he became a psaltis in, his school, his friends' houses, and he pointed out the Greek churches. And this pretty picture of all the different colors are very typical Istanbul Greek homes that are wooden with what we call the jumbes. And the jumba is this sort of interior rectangular bay window balcony that was spearheaded by the Greek architects that had trained elsewhere in Europe and then brought this style to the local sort of architecture scene or the landscape. And most of these houses are no longer occupied by Greeks, but this was very much that sort of late 19th century home style. And doing that sort of walk was very important because it made him feel comfortable with me. And then I got a chance to experience Istanbul and from a very different way, as opposed to having just met him at the restaurant where we later did the interview. But while those jumbes were very well maintained, as we can see, a lot of the other older buildings are not. And Istanbul has been growing its population in such rapidity. I think it's over 17 million reported citizens, and with undocumented people, it's close to 20 million. So some buildings may be repurposed, such as these, for storefronts, and may also just be under renovation. This is sort of another way that the local community sort of, especially the older members, sort of feel the loss of what the community has been. And something that I want to share also is that a lot of the particularly older members of the community make use of online spaces such as Facebook to post either pictures of themselves in Istanbul or also documents that they find. So this actually is a receipt from a bar that used to be in what is now Istiklal Caddesi. In Greek was Melasodos του Peran, or in French, the Randu de Pera. So what we see here is the bill or the receipt with the Ottoman Turkish script, French and Greek. We see cafés asafran, which is, asafran is the Spanish word for saffron coffee. And they were serving, in addition to beer, mastija and duziko. Duziko is actually the local pronunciation of uzo. And at first I was confused because I had encountered that before, but it was only until people told me that there is a brand of uzo called Dodeka, which was actually originally from Constantinople. The family was local before they moved to Greece. And in French, Dodeka, 12, is douze. And so people ask for the number 12 one, to duziko, and that became sort of the generic word, the same way that in English we say Kleenex for any generic facial tissue. That's sort of how part of the linguistic repertoire expanded or changed based on the local community. But documents like this are very important because it shows sort of the longevity of the community and their own personal connection to the history. And similarly, we have people that will showcase how, from a maybe more nostalgic perspective, photos of Istiklal Caddesi, that Megali Odo Tupera, where that bar was located. This is when they were first building the tram. And people are commenting on how aristocratic it was and how back when there were many more Greeks and other communities that were more vibrant. And that's often in comparison to what Istiklal Caddesi has become now. Granted, this is right before the pandemic in 2019. And of course, that's not representative of how it always looks, but it is an example of how the city dynamic has changed, how it was always a big city, but now it's become something even unrecognizable for a lot of other locals. So now I have a bunch of photos that I'm going to just go through at my own pace as I have a sort of conversation about some of the experiences I've had doing the fieldwork. Basically, I wanted to say that one of the most challenging parts of the fieldwork when I first went was the coup attempt of 2016. As I mentioned earlier, I waited about 3 weeks before I interviewed anyone. I was active in the church community in particular. It's sort of one of the few spaces that Istanbul Greeks feel comfortable participating in, or at least the older community members do. But then when I started interviewing people, after about a month of that, by mid-July, I had interviewed, I think, around 25 people. And I was starting to feel very excited that I was going to reach the 50 participant mark that I was hoping for. And on the night of the coup, I was actually at a taverna that's called Kumbara in Taksim neighborhood, very centrally located. And there was a Greek band. Musicians are from Greece, some of whom have been living in Istanbul for over 10 years. And they're called Tatavla Kefi. And they play mostly Rembetiko. And I wanted to interview them after, or at least ask them questions after they played about their experiences as being, Elarites in Istanbul and what that's like for them, and maybe add some more nuance to this context. But about an hour into the night, my friend that I was with said that he got news that the military was on the bridge, that there was this coup that was happening, and everybody needed to leave because they surely would go to Taksim. So we parted ways, and it's not terribly far from my family. My family's apartment is in Pangaltı, which is very close to Tatavla and very close to Taksim, about a 20-minute walk. So I could have taken the metro for the one stop, or I could have walked, and I ended up walking. And it was very bizarre. It was in a bit of a haze with the news sort of everyone getting it slowly, and all of the different outdoor bars and restaurants with flat screen TVs, everybody's watching it in real time and trying to make sense of everything. And I'm glad that I ended up walking home, because by the time I got home, all of the metros and public transportation was closed, so I could have been stuck underground. But when I was home, the fighter jets were flying so close they were breaking the sound barrier. It sounded like they were dropping bombs. Social media was closed. It was very difficult to have any kind of understanding of what was happening for all of that day. That neighborhood, which used to be relatively quiet in Pangaltı, has become a bustling extension of the city center. But that weekend, Friday, Saturday, you could hear a pin drop. Sunday, I slowly made my way, and then ultimately I went to one of the churches, Dodekapostolan in Feriköy, also close by, and I spoke with some of the people, and they said, "Oh, this is nothing. We've been through so much. We've been through 4 coups, and including the Septembriana and all these other things, So at first I was a bit taken aback, but then I was like, well, it makes sense. This is just another extension of what they've already experienced. I just want to quickly point out this photo. This is in Misakori, that same neighborhood as the first photo. And here we see Armenian, Hebrew, English, Ottoman, Turkish, Greek, and Russian. And what's curious is, I believe in all of the languages, it just says the American bakery, but in Greek it says the Greek-American bakery, because it was a Greek-owned business at the beginning of the 20th century. And so I thought after the coup, I was going to have a hard time finding people. The US had put a flight travel ban, and I didn't think I wasn't sure when I could come back, what was going to happen. But again, thanks to, in particular, Kyria Danai from Sirki and other organizations, I nearly doubled my participant pool, getting 44 people by the end of 2016, or my stay in 2016. And they rallied for me, and I'm very grateful for that. Even though there were some days that I had to go from the European Asian side to the Prince Islands, interviewing 7 people, starting my day at 5:30 in the morning, ending it at 2 a.m. and needing to take a lot of time for myself the following day to kind of make sense of everything. And I thought that after going to Athens in 2017, that when I would go in 2018 for the October, November, September through November months, it would be easier to interview people. It actually was harder because within those 2 years, there was the brain drain, a lot of nefarious things. And so people were even more distrusting than before. But thankfully, for a portion of my stay, my mother actually came to visit. And for some people, seeing her with me when we're going to events actually made them feel more comfortable. So these are also other considerations to take when you're trying to make sense of how to conduct research. And I didn't ever ask questions that were leading questions. I never wanted to make anyone feel uncomfortable bringing things up. So obviously after the coup, I didn't, I didn't bring up for example, the Septembriana, unless they talked about it first, things like that. And so I know I don't have very much time, so I'm going to quickly go through it. Normally, when I give these talks, as I say, I give a lot of detail, either sort of phonetic or other linguistic structure or discourse. I just wanted one example here where Irakli really, I think, nicely summarizes not every Istanbul Greek experience, but a very common one, in which it's the negotiation of, maintaining what could be understood as archaisms or older aspects of Greekness, such as vocabulary like ornitha. It can be also the sort of negotiation of not being proper to use Turkish, but actually that's a positive thing. Diversity is something that makes Istanbul Greek special. And, he uses the term Romyi as opposed to Elines, which is very common for a lot of Istanbul Greeks to use Elines specifically for people from Greece and the Romyi for the Istanbul Greeks. And actually in the my dissertation and the paper that was recently accepted, where I look at similar types of discourse where people are really connecting linguistic features as well as characteristics, behaviors, and so on with these labels. And that's a really important way that they're making sense of their experience. As I mentioned, I have a lot of different linguistic features that I've looked at. I know I don't have any time to go through them, but I want to just go through each of the slides very quickly, so that way if anyone wants to take a picture of them, they can. Here are some of the most prevalent linguistic features across different structures, whether they're also found in Northern Greek varieties, the Aegean or peripheral varieties, what could be understood as retentions or archaisms, contact-induced change, and either inconsistencies or innovations. And I'll just give like a few minutes because this we have aspects of the lexicon, we have contact-induced change from the lexicon. I'm going through each of the slides very, very quickly, so I know if you can just follow me there. We have morphological aspects, and some of these are actually going to be found in an upcoming encyclopedia entry for Brill that I wrote on the variety. Normally I have many recordings. I just want to play one very quickly to demonstrate, so you can hear other Istanbul Greek speakers talking.
Ξεριανούμε. Η μητέρα μου, ο πατέρας μου που πολύ τα ξεριανούνε. Εγώ η αλήθεια δεν τα ξεριανώ. Κάποτε στη δουλειά μας, που είναι το πρόγραμμα.
Αυτό είναι, και αυτό μου αρέσει, μάλιστα.
Άλλο τίποτα δεν ξεριανώ, γιατί και πολλοί δεν τους καταλαβαίνω η αλήθεια. Πολύ γρήγορα μιλούν και δεν τους καταλαβαίνω και αυτή τη φορά νευριάζω. Η μαμά τη λέω δεν καταλαβαίνω τίποτα, άφησε με, δεν θέλω να τα βλέπω. Αλλά η μητέρα και ο μπαμπάς τα ξεριανούν και τους αρέσει.
So that is a very typical middle-aged Istanbul Greek woman. We see the verb from Turkish seyretmek, which means to watch. In I believe in Standard Greek, it means to like wander around or stroll or something. But in Istanbul Greek, it's maintained the meaning to watch television or a movie or something. But it can either be seryaniz or seryano. And she also discusses, interestingly enough, it's hard for her to understand Standard Greek speakers. She thinks they speak too fast, when more likely it's probably intonational differences rather than rate of speech. I'm going through these other slides again very, very quickly, because I know time is not on our side right now. But again, we have different levels of language structure, from lexicon, morphology, syntax, pragmatic differences, which come into play quite a bit. Cultural differences that influence the variety in many ways. And again, even though I don't have time to talk about it in this talk, since we're just about done, if you have any questions about any aspects of this work that are interesting to you, you're more than welcome to. I will just briefly say that lateral velarization, what we call in English the dark L, or in Greek heavy L, is very, very prominent in Istanbul Greek. So Standard Greek la leli lolu, in Istanbul Greek is la leli lolu. So similar to Northern Greek varieties, but more advanced actually. And another feature that kept coming up, but to a lesser degree, was that in Standard Greek we have taf sigma as a coronal affricate. In Istanbul Greek it tends to be further back, post-alveolar ch. And so sometimes Istanbul Greeks get confused for Cypriots, because even though they don't necessarily do that for that specific affricate of a tsa, you have the allophone of the velar series, K, Chechi, Koku, which doesn't happen in Istanbul Greek, just people associate that sound. So very briefly, I want to show how I did a verbal guise experiment where I took some of the recordings from my Istanbul Greek speakers and my Standard Greek speakers I interviewed in Athens. I took about 30-second clips from areas where they were talking about travels, trips, vacations, because I wanted to see if people could recognize an Istanbul Greek accent or speaker, and if they gave the same sort of aspects or characteristics, like Istanbul Greeks viewing themselves as being more cosmopolitan versus Standard Greek speakers being more horiatic, more villager style. So what I ended up doing a few months ago was I had this online survey where people had to listen to each of the speakers, each of the recordings, I should say, on a scale of 1 to 10 for these 8 different characteristics. And then the next page, they had the same clip where they tried to guess where the speaker was from and what made them think that. And then they ultimately gave any information about themselves, including if they knew Istanbul Greeks or what they think Istanbul Greeks sound like. I had 74 participants, 7 of whom were Istanbul Greeks themselves, 20 of them who weren't, but had some familiarity, and the rest had no idea. And ultimately, what ended up happening was that Istanbul Greeks correctly guessed the Istanbul Greeks speakers, makes sense. Those who didn't have any connection at all couldn't. And most of the time, Istanbul Greek speakers were guessed to be either Northern Greek, Cypriot, islander of some kind, foreign, and only one Istanbul Greek was sometimes guessed to be a Standard Greek speaker, but no Standard Greek speaker was ever guessed to be Istanbul Greek. And I ran a bunch of statistical analysis, which I don't have time to discuss, but I want to, in detail, but I want to say that the Istanbul Greeks were rated slightly as more friendly or more likable than Standard Greek speakers, which I thought was interesting. But then it turned out that most likely it was just this one participant who laughed for a portion of his recording, most likely bolsters that sort of ranking. And then importantly, the idea of being cosmopolitan, which is so linked for Istanbul Greeks, it's and registered for them. The Standard Greek speakers were rated much more cosmopolitan and less of a villager than Istanbul Greeks. And if we left it at that, it would be very sort of disconnected with what my ethnographic research shows. But then I did a statistical analysis with an interaction, and what we see is that the Istanbul Greek raters evaluated the Istanbul Greek speakers as more cosmopolitan, significantly so than they rated the Standard Greek speakers, and more so than the Standard Greek raters evaluated the Istanbul Greek speakers. And that's a very complicated way of saying that people are using their own experience to make these evaluations. So in conclusion, the Istanbul Greeks have experienced a lot of trauma, and that doesn't necessarily define who they are, but it certainly impacts how they connect to the other types of communities, right? When they're called Turkospori by mainland Greeks, there's also sort of makes them want to distinguish themselves, for example. My heritage, even though I'm not a native speaker, even though I wasn't born into the community, that actually helped because of my connections to the community. And because I wasn't born there, a lot of people felt comfortable to explain certain aspects of their experience to me that they otherwise would have said, well, what's the point? You should know this. There were tensions with asking certain questions, and I had to come up with ways to sort of avoid certain topics unless they were brought up. But that comes with any experience doing fieldwork. And ultimately, the lived experience is really what I want to take home with doing this sort of ethnographic fieldwork, especially for minoritized communities that are vulnerable, because that just shows you how we may take certain things for granted or make certain assumptions that may not necessarily bear out. And the reason why I showed you that guy's experiment was to show that if we don't consider ethnography, if we don't consider that more qualitative hands-on experience, doing something that's more quantitative may only scratch the surface of actually what's going on. And we see a lot more nuance in sociolinguistic research when we're able to combine that sort of ethnographic detail with the bigger data-driven models. So I end with this graffiti that was posted on a wall in Galata neighborhood after the coup attempt, because I think it's a nice reminder for everybody, but also it's sort of, for me, symbolic of the Istanbul Greek community, that they're li ala sidereni, right? So few, but strong. So with that, I thank you all for your attention. I thank everyone for their It's late, I know, for me too. I'm more of a morning person, so I hope I still have the energy to engage at least a little bit. And yes, that's what I have for you.
So much, Matthew. This is fascinating stuff. I'm sure there will be questions. I would like to ask you one thing regarding vulnerability. It seems to me that the more around which vulnerability is built, like pogroms, whatever, is by now far removed. I understand that this community must be circumspect, like most communities are in my experience. I mean, you can ask majority communities and as a relative outsider about what they do linguistically, and you will find that they're equally circumspect. So where would you place the trauma with, let's say, current relevance? Because I'm not quite sure that the pogrom experience in 55, for example, is there for people who are living there now and who were children who weren't born at that time.
No, I think that's a great point. And so the reason why I brought that up is that I initially went there with the goal of interviewing particularly older speakers because of, you know, when I was younger in my training, the idea of the, you know, the authentic sort of variety speaker that I wanted to get. So I was interviewing people mostly in their 70s and 80s, even some younger people, but that was sort of the goal, to maintain as many dialectal features. And a lot of people didn't want, the second they saw a recorder, they were like, no, thank you, please, no, why do you want to interview us? We don't speak that different. Some people insisted that they weren't that different from, oh, if you want to know how we speak, go to Thessaloniki, it's not that different. Or we don't speak that different from Athens. Whereas others said, oh, kamia skesi, we're completely different. So I would say for the older speakers, there was, for me, more than anything, a fear. I didn't want to say anything that may upset them. And because if I ask them questions about their experience as a minority or as a minoritized group, not necessarily just the pogrom in and of itself, but as among other sorts of features that may be interpreted as some kinds of subversive act, for example, that would have maybe made certain people uncomfortable with participating. And I didn't want anybody to say, oh, he's going to ask you questions about the 1964 deportations or about these things. So I didn't bring them up unless they came up in the interview, if they mentioned it themselves. And I didn't even feel comfortable to ask them questions like, well, how do you identify? Because that could also be problematic. And I didn't want them to, you know, say to their friends and families, oh, no, not this one, don't trust him. You know, he's going to try to, you know, manipulate you. So that's what it is. But the younger speakers, especially in 2018, that's when I got more people in their 20s and 30s. And a lot of them were like, yeah, for us, it was okay growing up, you know, where most of our friends are Turks. And even some of the older participants, they said their closest friends are Turkish because they often felt sort of disenfranchised by the mainland Greeks, or that they're constantly being doubted of their Greekness, for example. So it's not necessarily the pogrom, it's not necessarily the sort of larger acts, it's more about the, how do you bridge these topics more generally?
Thank you. I think we have another question. Marianthi Tsilipakou has raised a hand. Marianthi?
Hello, everybody. Hello, John, Matthew, Hadodo. It's a pity we didn't have enough time to look at the linguistic characteristics. Of course, the sociological part is so very important, but I wish we had more time to look at these characteristics. And since both families of my grandparents came from Asia Minor, although not Istanbul, I'm very much familiar with all these differentiations in lexes and pronunciation, etc. But I wonder whether you are familiar with the fact that most of these characteristics are part of the idiolect, the dialect of the lower classes, or not only northerners, I would think, like Erotixa, Plerosa, and stuff like that, apart from the dark L, which is endemic to Thessaloniki, where I come from, because of the fact that so very many people came over from Asia Minor. So the reason, I guess, behind the rating of Istanbul Greeks as not cosmopolitan, the way they want to think of themselves, is because many of these characteristics are to be found in the dialect, if you wish, the idiom that lower classes or uneducated people use in Greece. It's not just, I guess it's not only the northerners who do that stuff. Huh? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good.
Yeah. Like Alone, Aftona, and stuff like that, this stuff like the examples you gave us. So that might be one reason in the Maths Guide test that didn't get the cosmopolitan thing there, although they didn't, I don't know, did you get the uneducated stuff there? No, huh?
No, that's actually a great point. So very, very quickly, yes, I agree. I think part of what makes the Istanbul Greek context so interesting and so complicated is that we see features that are found from all over sort of the Greek-speaking world, whether it's certain verbal conjugations, whether it's certain morphological declensions, lexical lexis, and phonetics and phonology. And I agree. I think what happened very much so, and that was sort of my intention, was I tried to find clips of the speakers where they had not just the dark L, but the ch for ts, because I wanted to see if people are going to, or are they going to confuse them? Well, they're doing something that we associate with Northern Greece, but something that is mistaken for something that's Southern. And that is what happened. So I think what happens with that cosmopolitan villager sort of divide is that the standard Greek speakers, or Greek speakers in general, viewed anything non-standard as not cosmopolitan, right? Regardless of what it is. But the Istanbul Greek speakers and others who are familiar could recognize that. And also obviously the content of the recordings that also plays an influence. And yes, and so in the Brill encyclopedia entry, one of my claims is that you actually see some of the features that we see are also found in other Doric substrates. So for example, in Crete, in the old Athenian that's allegedly extinct, we see some of those same features with like Naxuris this rather than Naxiris this, Ketalipa. So those are potentially some kind of Northern Greeks with a Doric substrate, then with all of the sort of migration from Chios, from Crete, from different parts of the Greek-speaking world, kind of made its own Koine that was parallel to the Hellenistic Koine. It's a very complicated picture, and obviously we don't have that much historic data, but some of the things that Macridge and others have shown by like looking at Psycharis' work and these Phanariot elites, we're seeing even the Phanariot elite are using some of these features. So it's not necessarily.
By the way, there used to be this stereotypical representation of Politisa, and we can see that also, you know, in revues and in films. I mean, a Politisa who had moved on to Thessaloniki and then to Athens, and it was noticed that she spoke differently. Okay, so there you are. Okay, thanks anyway. Thank you, and good luck with your work.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your questions.
Hearing Marianti's question and your position, I think that what might be said to be differentiating Istanbul Greek is the presence of all these shibboleths at the same time. Obviously, Pleroxa, Erotixa, and stuff like that are obviously marked low class in Greece, and they have no place of origin. It is simply low class. It is simply hardly educated and low class. But at the same time, the L in Plerosa or Plerosa will not be the same as in Istanbul, in the Istanbul Greek community. So this is something you might want to check into. That is the co-presence of all of these characteristics. As for cosmopolitanism goes, I know of no variety that veers off from the standard, including English in any of its versions that can be considered cosmopolitan. So basically this is a phantasmatic category of the community itself. I'm not quite sure that anybody else looks at them this way. So this is, I think, crucial for future research. And we have a question which touches upon this by one of the people in our audience. If you could check Q&A, there is a question by, sorry, in the chat. Electra Gatu has articulated a question in writing.
Yes.
Can you see?
So, yes, I just pulled it up now. So it says, my question is, what is the meaning of cosmopolitan when we talk about Constantinople and the Rum community of that time? Can this be generalization? Can the use of this be problematic? Of how it's, okay, so I think that's a great question. This is an emic term. This is how a lot of the Istanbul Greeks refer to themselves. It's not one that I'm placing on them. It's not one that Urs or Halstead are placing on them necessarily either. It's one that a lot of them sort of take pride in, saying that by acknowledging the diversity, by acknowledging the integration and the sort of lived experience, and that's really what I am focusing so much on with this specific aspect of the research, that it's not just we speak a certain way. It's not just a continuation of, you know, the same way of doing things, but rather it's, we are trying to sort of reclaim some semblance of legitimacy. And actually in the Routledge book that I'm co-editing, I have a chapter on the Istanbul Greek community and how they're negotiating authenticity and legitimacy. And I think what tends to happen is that when you come from a minoritized group, what you try to do is make sense of why you do things the way that you do to lend itself to being privileged in some way. So what happens is, for example, the use of the accusative for the historic dative, which is also a shibboleth of Northern Greek varieties, as we know, is very, very prominent with Istanbul Greeks. And even those that have largely shifted, as many in particular of the younger speakers do. One thing to note is that younger speakers do tend to shift to Standard Greek, especially if they go to the remaining Istanbul Greek schools. If they go, because of the education system trying to mirror or parallel more of what is found in Greece. But if they go, like my mother did, to one of the French schools, Saint-Benoît, they go to the Austrian school, or if they go to the Italian schools or what have you, they actually tend to retain more of the Istanbul Greek productions because of their association, their experience with the Greek being more of a family language. That was a tangent. But what ends up happening with this, even the speakers that have largely shifted to, let's say, a standard Greek, a lot of them will still maintain the accusative because they don't like how namukani skati sounds, because it sounds to them choriatiko. And a lot of them say, well, actually, if you look at the historical data, before, when the dative was lost, and it should have been, I guess, something like namidosi or something, the tendency in the Byzantine era was for it all around to go to the accusative, namedosi, whatever. And then it was a southernism, let's say, to have the genitive. Regardless of it's true or not, they're trying to use some kind of historical factor to legitimize their way of speaking. And oftentimes people will say, well, you know, in Greece, they have this fetishization of the classical era. We're not related to Aristophanes or, you know, Alexandros Omegas, etc. You know, they try to erase the Byzantine and Ottoman heritage, but we're embracing it because that is, we're living it, you know, when you, everywhere you go. And I can't also underplay the role of the church, even though younger speakers, younger Istanbul Greeks are maybe more mixed in their involvement with the church or religiosity. The older speakers, they really use these spaces as a way to maintain the cultural traditions. And because of the patriarchy being so intimately tied to Istanbul, that's another way that these speakers sort of blend being in a predominantly Muslim country, but having this strong Orthodox Christian roots that make them, in their opinion, more Greek, because in Athens, they say there's no ayazmata, there's nothing. Here you go, every corner there's ayazma, etc., for example. So I really was trying to bridge the material cultural practices with the linguistic as part of broader sort of semiotic field of how they're making sense of things. And I agree that if we're using a modern lens, going back to Electra's comment, it may be problematic if we're applying it in terms of a sort of multi-culti perspective, but this is really how the community is syncretically making sense of their experience, being in some ways archaic, in some ways more modern, in some ways more sophisticated, in some ways more conservative. You know, there's lots of tensions there, and the way that they navigate these, sometimes going back and forth, is quite fascinating. But I think that's how minoritized communities have to make sense of their experience at the same time.
This is absolutely a cogent account of how minorities seem to be making up their self-representation to others. And I believe that you might want to look into some of the writings of Christidis about modern day cosmopolitanism, which is probably has nothing to do with what cosmopolitanism means. I have no qualms about cosmopolitanism being the issue with Istanbul Greek or with how people look at themselves. Obviously, even some of the pictures you showed us with multiple languages being represented are iconic of this. On the other hand, I think you might also want to check a couple of examples that run by too fast, such as Kalos Enas Anthropos, which is an absolute first for me, although there is a lot of Turkish influence on lesbian dialects. At times sounding like Turkish constructions. I have never come across that. I think that's a very strong point. Along with everything else, though, not in and of itself, I believe that the strength of this analysis has to do with the different strands of difference. There's phonetic strands, phraseological and lexical strands, some minor syntactic things that can be found almost everywhere else, but this one is a biggie. I mean, Kalos Enas Anthropos, it's like Shekeli Birkave. I mean, it's like you can't find that outside of Turkey, really.
Well, and thank you for bringing that up. Actually, there's even more Turkish influence on the syntax, and this is why if we look at a traditional sort of borrowing scale a la Thompson and Kaufman, we see it's probably a 4, 3 or 4 in terms of the linguistic structure that's been borrowed, and a 4 or 5 in terms of the intensity, but we don't have a mixed language like we do with the Asia Minor, Cappadocian varieties. And I think that has to do with this sort of insistence of Istanbul Greeks maintaining, to a certain extent, ties with the rest of the Greek-speaking world, but then also wanting to maintain their ways of doing things. And more extreme examples of the syntax, in one of my upcoming, my 4th papers, it's actually a family member of mine. He says, right? So you have, even with these sort of set constructions, you have the positioning, this SOV structure that wants to come through. So moving the complement in between to make it more of an object, right? Which for me, I have no problem with. It sounds fine for me. But when I said that when I wrote that in one of my papers, actually Petros Karachareas was saying this is like unintelligible in most Greek varieties. You know, I was like, oh, I didn't, you know. And these are things that it helps to have a collaborative environment, because again, as a heritage speaker, for me, it's normal to say things like that without a second thought, or actually kalos enes anthropos, that's something that I said to somebody, and they said, oh, that's Turkish phrase structure rules coming into play. And I said, oh, and then I looked, and I started, when they pointed it out, then I started seeing more ibiradam, exactly.
Nice.
Such things, and you find them rampantly. So exactly, it's like you said, it's this constellation of contact-induced change, whether it's from Turkish, quite a bit from Romance languages. I mean, rather than calling like cash money, they say papel, because that's the Spanish coming from Ladino meaning paper. So for paper money, charco for a puddle, which is just the Spanish word. Σε μένα υπάρχει δουλειά, μπορεί να το πει, το έχουμε off, so on and so forth. These are all part of how they're negotiating sort of historical things by using, lexical items. Like for me, I didn't know mulipis as a construction to say, I miss you. For me, it's always sapothimisa, right? Which I didn't recognize. It's it's considered maybe outdated, but also it would have to have the certain internal augment of se epithemisa if it's going to be said. But for me, that would be unheard of. I would just say sapothemisa, right? So we see these sorts of, and that's also noted in Horrocks and Mackridge discussing the Phanari elite. So clearly that's something that was, if not exclusive to Istanbul, that was something that was definitely productive in Istanbul or Constantinople. So these are things that how you take these maybe internal structures or language internal innovations with the contact-induced change, whether it's at the lexical level into, all these other things. And so, yeah, I agree that it's emblematic of being cosmopolitan to a certain extent. I think I may be rambling now because it's getting late, but I want to answer any other questions anybody has. So please feel free to.
From what I see, there are no more questions. In my opinion, you have answered them all very well and completely. So unless there is another question, I just say thank you notes from all over the place, which is lovely. Teşekkürler from people in Turkey. Good evening to people all over the place, from all over the place. It's lovely to have a speaker who's born in the US, different, of various, I mean, a heritage speaker of Greek, but also, I believe, from boasting other roots, now living in Bern and bringing us close to people in Turkey, I guess Istanbul, but not only. So it's just lovely to have had you here. And do come back with more when you get a chance, and when situations are more favorable for your research. It must not have been easy. I can easily understand the reserve of smaller communities, be they minoritized or not. Small communities, not necessarily minoritized, but it might be a de facto minority. So I respect that, and I respect the perspective that you gave us about the major point being not causing harm to the community in whatever way. So unless we have another final question, maybe, I would like to thank Matthew for a very rich and interesting presentation. The ones of us who are interested in more specific details, I am sure we can find his work either through online sources for his dissertation or for the texts to come.
Yes, and I'm going to send my email if anybody wants to email me with specific questions. Absolutely. I'll just put it in the chat if that's okay. Absolutely. All right. And yes, I cannot thank everyone enough. I did panelists, so maybe I should do everyone.
Thank you for taking the time to put together this really rich presentation. It has been a pleasure and an honor to have you with us. And I'm sure people can find out more about your research from published sources, as we typically do.
Yeah, hopefully soon there will be more out there soon.
Hopefully soon. Hopefully soon. Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ.
Και εγώ όπως λέμε στην πόλη, καλή ευκολιά.
Καλή
Yeah.
ευκολία. Εγώ το ξέρω αυτό καλή ευκολία, όπως ξέρω και από Κωνσταντινούπολη στο Chalk Mercy.
Merci. Bravo. So thank you so much. Much appreciated. And
Καλό
all the
βράδυ
best.
σε όλες και όλους. Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ, Μάθη. Καλό βράδυ.
Thank you.